So my talk is probably a bit long. I've got an option to talk about the recent science paper that some of you might have heard about. They submitted a bonus article to Open Access Journals. We've got time and there's sufficient interest, I think we can talk about it. So what I'm going to briefly discuss is about growth of open access. Fortunately, Phil's just covered the policy side really nicely, so I won't have to do too much of that. And then talk about open research as a network, what it means for us, the community of publishers and researchers, how we can adapt to this more open network, and then a little bit about managing the transition from subscription-based to open access, and then a little bit on the sting of this time. And just want to let you know you're free to reuse this presentation as long as you attribute the work and respect the rights and licenses within it. So I have a slightly different definition of open access. It's not only free to read, it includes absolutely no embargoes and the rights to reuse that material. And it's the reuse rights that is just absolutely crucial to the open access movement because it changes the way we communicate research and how others can use that research.
Could you use the microphone, please?
Yep. I can hold that. That better? Yeah, so the reuse, the ability to reuse the material, and we think it's also important to the humanities, although I'm concentrating on the biomedical sciences, is absolutely crucial. It's not only the UK, but there's been many policy initiatives, especially over the past couple of years in the US. I won't go into those in detail, but if anyone wants to ask me about them, I'd be happy to let them know. Again, Phil's kind of gone through all the UK initiatives of the HEFCE consultation where the radical thing is that only open access articles will be considered for the REF after 2014. So there's still time if you want to submit any written statements to that. It's the end of next week. And it's all over the world with the European Commission, RC UK, World Bank, as well as individual universities having some kind of mandate or policy about open access or free access. And this is just a relatively recent map of those types of fund or institutional mandates across the world. PLOS itself, we've been a not-for-profit publisher for 10 years. We've been self-sustaining as a pure open access publisher, charging article processing fees since 2010, and we publish 7 peer-reviewed journals. These we started off with the 2 highly selective, based on subjective assessments of novelty and importance and how big an advance a paper represented. And these journals have more than 90% rejection rates. We then subsequently launched a suite of what we call community journals because they're modelled on society-based publishing, which are run purely by academics. PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine are run by professional editors, and I was one of those on PLOS Biology for 10 years. And this was very, very traditional, and the idea was to show that open access was compatible with good quality research. And then we provided our only really first innovative step since actually launching open access, and that was PLOS One. And PLOS One, it has to be scientifically rigorous, properly reported, conclusions supported by the data, but the key innovation was that editors and reviewers should not ask how important the work is, so that essentially everything that ought to be published can be published and made available for reuse. And this includes negative results, case studies, descriptive material as well. And just to show you that PLOS One gets highly cited, these are the top 200 papers in PLOS One. They have a median citation of 51 compared with PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine, which are considered the sort of flagships in terms of impact. These numbers are now a bit out of date. I think our most recent estimate is 95,000 articles that we've published since launch, and we've had 46 Nobel laureates, most of whom published in PLOS One. But it's not just PLOS, there's a whole growth of open access. These are perhaps the most reputable, well-known, major and pure open access publishers. And the rise since 2010 has been phenomenal, although we are still a relatively small proportion of the entire literature. There was an EU report commissioned just earlier this year that said actually 50% of articles are now free access. We think that's an overestimate. They might be free to read, but many of them come with embargoes. Most of them don't come with licenses that make reuse available. Let's Go and Bjork actually published in 2012 an estimate that probably put open access at around 17 to 20%. But I think there's no doubt we're at a tipping point. And it's no longer a question of if open access is going to happen, but when and how. But what does it actually mean to be open? And this is work by Catriona MacCullum, who's our Director of Advocacy at PLOS. And one way to look at this for researchers is that your work can help someone. And this is a way to think about it. It's an illustration that the probability of helping someone depends on the proportion of people that are actually interested and could use your work, plus whether they can actually use it where they were able to access it, and the number of people you can reach. But also, open access means that there is someone out there who might be able to help you. And likewise, the probability of getting help depends on the proportion of work out there that you can use, the ease with which those people can contribute their work, and the number of people you can reach. And the thing is that the number of interested people out there is fixed. There's only a limited number of researchers in certain fields or people out there who can actually use that information. And the two key things is that you want the ability to use that material, the friction, or what Cameron's termed friction, to be as small as possible. And for N, the number you can possibly reach, to be as large as possible. And so being open is acting to reduce that friction, to create an easier way to reuse the material and to maximise N. And this happens for both outgoing and incoming information. And +1, by not focusing on subjectivity, actually helps reduce the friction because it makes it easier to publish without going through rounds and rounds of peer review through numerous journals so you can get your work out there. And of course, why does it matter? The obvious reasons is that scientific information is a public good. We hold a public trust to release that information. But fundamentally, the world has changed, and the number we can reach is potentially limitless. So we can no longer need to depend on subscription journals targeting very specific audiences and having barriers to access in order to reach the people who can use their information. Everyone can potentially be part of that audience, and that changes the way communication happens, and it changes the role of publishers. And it means that science and science communication has become a bit like a network. So whether it's a sort of protein regulation network in E. coli, associations between ants, these networks all have certain properties. And again, this is from Cameron's work. We illustrate this just with simple simulation. And the basic message here is that when networks are small, they tend to be less connected. But at a certain size of the network, there's a rapid transition, an absolute shift to where there's a much greater probability of making connections between different bits of the network. And eventually you get very large interconnected networks and one system. And I don't know where we are on that, but we're probably not yet at that central bit where there is that rapid shift. We haven't got yet the percentage of open access material and the ability to reuse it. And of course, what would this enable? Some of the most obvious things come from crowdsourcing. This is Tim Gower's work. He's a mathematician. He wanted to know whether he could collaboratively solve a mathematical problem. He thought about this on 27th of January. He put the problem out there to anyone on the web on February the 1st. He didn't think it would be solved. He thought they might go some way towards solving it. And a month later, it was probably solved. Another famous example is Galaxy Zoo, where they put images of galaxies on the web and hundreds of thousands of people went and mapped them and provided data that fed back into the project. We're also trying to encourage PLOS ways to demonstrate how open access research can promote innovation. And this has been done in association with Google and the Wellcome Trust and other sponsors. And the awards actually came out this week on Monday as part of Open Access Week. This is Daniel Meacham's work. He invented a tool that crawls the literature, identifies the license, works out whether you can reuse the material, extracts images, audio, and video files, and then makes it available on Wikimedia for others to reuse. And there are also a couple of others which I won't go into. So how do we adapt to a network? How can we best reduce that friction, make information easy to reuse? And I'll briefly touch on all of these. And I'm slightly shifting off topic for research assessment, but it is part of the main story. This is the classic publisher cartoon peer review. But this is a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago in PLOS Biology by a professor at Sussex, Adamir Walker and Nina Steletsky, where they looked at whether scientists were any good at assessing whatever the merit of a paper, whatever that is, or whether they were able to actually predict the impact of the paper in terms of the number of citations the paper might accrue over 5 years. And they looked at the rankings, where two or more papers had been ranked by assessors, and the data came from a faculty of 1,000 and also a Wellcome Trust grant panel where they were assessing papers. And they looked at it in relation to citations and the impact factor. And this is just a snapshot of the data. What they basically showed is that there is very weak, very low correlation between the ranking of one scientist and what's good and another scientist. So the correlation between ranks, between assessor scores was very low, and then if you look at the relationship of that to citations, that's also very low. So the sort of conclusion is that subjective assessments of science are actually very, very poor. Scientists aren't any good at doing this. And moreover, was most biased. Most of the correlation we found was actually with the impact factor. And if you exclude the impact factor, then the correlation is incredibly weak. So it's very biased by the journal in which the paper is published, which of course most of us haven't know about that. Carl Bergstrom, who's one of the reviewers, said what this paper shows is that whatever merit might be, scientists can't be doing a good job of evaluating it when they rank the importance or quality of papers. From the lack of correlation among assessor scores, most of the variation in ranking has to be due to error. And in terms of whether scientists can predict the future citations, they can't, and that's because of two reasons. One is that they're not good at assessing merit, and also because similar articles accumulate citations essentially by chance. You also get a very inflationary effect. So articles published in high impact papers accrue many, many more citations than articles in lower impact journals. And that was an analysis based on duplicate publications actually that was done. It was also found in this study. The last research assessment exercise cost about 16 million, and the conclusion of the paper is, well, what actually are assessors adding to this? Multiple assessors don't make much difference. As I said, the citations impact factor exaggerates the difference. And assessor bias and the impact factor could actually affect the ranking of universities and tenure. There's actually a lot more to this paper, and I wrote an editorial along with Cameron Naylor and Jonathan Eisen if you want to read more about it. But the basic message is we need to abandon subjective ratings of articles. And this is, again, it goes back to reducing that friction and getting stuff out there and then evaluating it. And that's again, the rationale behind PLOS One's editorial policy. So how can we measure impact? Impact is very important to funders and researchers. And this is, we think, instead of using things like journal rank or the impact factor, we need to look at the intrinsic merits of the articles. And PLOS has developed what they're calling article level metrics, but there's actually many others out there doing it, including York Metrics, Community, Dixon, Green, and others. And the idea is to look at a range of different metrics according to traditional methods such as downloads or citations, but also including social web and social networking measures. And so here's an article from a UCL researcher. Some of you may know, and you can see that immediately on the article, the number of views, the number of citations are put up there prominently. You can go to a metrics page and look at this in more detail, including all the different types of citations, including mentions in fact of 1,000. All the data can be downloaded and analysed if you wish. You can also look at how readers behave, and in terms of downloads versus citations versus tweets or whatever. Most of us don't know what this means yet, but at least we're beginning to gather the data. And then you can extract information from this. So this is EU-funded papers with the time along the x-axis, the number of views on the y-axis, and the number of citations. And again, this is a sort of nice visual way of looking at articles. I'm not sure how much it tells you yet. I mean, one of the problems with citations is they are, because different papers accumulate citations by chance, we don't actually understand what it is that's driving citation behavior behind articles like that. This is UCL articles published in 2010 to 2011, and those are color-coded by the journals with yellow +1 and green with biology. Again, it's a similar sort of thing, and you can see some articles are unexpectedly highly downloaded, others accrue more citations more quickly than you might expect, and you can look at that sort of thing and try and work out what the reasons are. That one up there, which is highly cited and highly downloaded, I don't know if anyone knows the authors of that one. And you can also see where UCL authors are collaborating all over the world. The other aspect, apart from reducing friction around research assessment and trying to understand it more, is what you do with data. How do you make data more easily used? And like many other publishers, we now have a partnership with Dryad, where authors who don't have traditional repositories to submit their data can submit to. And I suspect actually the speaker after me, Lion, will be talking more about this, so I won't go into too much detail. We also have a partnership with Figshare. Figshare is a platform where you can upload essentially anything, and they host our supplementary files for us. And we have planning in hand for a data sharing statement so that every single paper has a statement clearly on the front of the article about how the data in that paper is made available, whether it's in a traditional repository, if not, where can it be found. And we won't be allowing statements like available on request and that sort of issue. There will be exceptions, for example, patient confidentiality on endangered species, etc. So that's still a developing policy and we haven't implemented it yet. This is just to illustrate supplementary figures within Figshare, and then it goes to the Figshare site and you can actually extract the figures. The benefit of this is a different platform, which can also provide access to information. And because we have a liberal license and because it's freely available immediately, it means that wherever researchers, whatever platforms researchers are using, they can more easily find the information they need. We're also interested in validating research, and just for time I won't go into this too much. But again, if people are interested, I can talk about it afterwards. So in terms of managing the transition, we know it's definitely going to happen, but in some respects it hasn't happened as fast as we thought, as Phil said. But one of the things we do want to avoid, because I think it is increasing, the rate of open access is increasing, is replacing the sort of big subscription deals with obscure non-disclosure agreements with big deals about APC. So we need to have price transparency. And as already has been mentioned, we need to discourage double dipping, and we definitely need a mixture of repositories and open access journals, whatever way it works. But I think in terms of repositories, just to ensure that they're interoperable, at the moment we would favour the larger disciplinary repositories, which have the infrastructure available for extracting information and doing this and linking out to databases. And we need competition within the open access market. We need an effective market, which is again where the price transparency comes into. We need differentiated products and differentiated business models. No one person's business model has yet proven to be the right one, and there are many different ones. Open access publishers themselves, the gold route, not everyone charges an article processing fee. There are different models available. And we also need to make sure that we're collaborating with either traditional legacy publishers in terms of them genuinely moving towards open access, but also collaborating as an OA community with libraries and publishers and researchers. And we need to ensure a coherent global policy agenda. That map I showed earlier, there are as many policies as there are spots on the map, and it's just, you can't deal with that, especially it's quite difficult as a publisher trying to deal with all that different information. For researchers themselves, it needs to be clear and simple. And we need interoperability between platforms. And of course, because resources are limited, we have to make choices about where we're going to put the money. Platforms, and in some ways, we had a publisher. I was in Lausanne yesterday, and there was a publisher there who doesn't call themselves a publisher anymore, they're a technology platform. But platforms that increase reach and reduce friction require investment, and we don't yet understand the balance between those and how best to resource them. And we don't even understand about knowledge sharing ourselves. We don't even have data enough data on the way this information can be shared and how it's used. And so we need better frameworks to be able to make those choices. So I can stop here.
No, I got 5 minutes.
Yeah. So the LOC, do people know about the background to this? Does anyone say no? Okay. So this was journalist science. They submitted a fake, bogus, very bad, flawed article to, I think about 400 open access journal publishers who charge article processing fees, and 100 and something journals accepted. Okay. And there was a lot of news stories around about this. I'm a member of the board of the Open Access Publishers, Scholarly Publishing Society as well, and we issued a statement. If you want to go and read that in more detail about it. This is a map of the red dots indicate where those articles were accepted. The hoops are location between banks and the publishing industry. I mean, it was an interesting study. But we know there are dodgy journals and publishers out there. And crucially, it's important that none of the major pure open access reputable publishers published accepted the article. In fact, PLOS ONE was pulled out for the rigour with which it did the peer review beforehand, and other pure open access publishers accepted the paper. The data are useful as confirmation. We know there are bad publishers out there, but there was no control. The articles were never submitted to any of the subscription journals, so you can't say anything about how good open access is per se. It was very selective. They only used open access journals that charged article fees, and they hit some of Beale's list. Beale's list is famous for tracking these dodgy publishers and dodgy journals. Most open access articles that you see today are published with the reputable publishers. The legacy publishers, that's what we're interesting, who are moving into open access, were also stung. It does raise questions in general, I think, about peer review, and going back to that paper I was describing, peer review isn't perfect, it's full of biases. Crucially, actually, Science spun the story, both in the press release, to be sort of more anti-open access than the actual article itself, and that was also led by their editor-in-chief. The basic thing is, like dodgy banks, dodgy emails, dodgy insurance, these journals are not difficult, but there are free riders who take advantage of any system. And it's not an indictment of open access. And one of the things is, it's amazing, there are editors and absolutely good academics who join the editorial boards of some of these journals and are not then accountable or don't seem to be taking responsibility for any of the decisions there. They're not looking at what they're putting their name to. There are authors, some authors publishing in these journals, and I think it's a product both of the fact that you're always going to get dodgy practice regardless of the system or business model you have, but also the pressure to publish. Oh, I just wanted to point out here that in terms of selection, this is actually, this is for up to 2011, well, I think it's just less than half here of open access journals actually then charge article processing fees, but there are differences. But the pressure to publish is huge, and I think again it's this systemic culture, and it's the culture of the impact factor in high-profile journals and getting a publication that helps set this up. And this is the OASPA Member Code of Conduct. So we noticed that there were a couple of members that we have reviewed that did accept the pay cut, and we're looking at their practices very closely, and we'll be making a statement about those. But one of the things we have picked up is actually a lack of editorial oversight. So how do you stay afloat in this big system? Warts and all. Well, you have to provide a good quality of service, value for money, make sure you're sustainable, provide impact of some description and nature, and ultimately our core business is to get authors' work into the hands of those who can use it. So our business is now about dissemination and not distribution. It's about discovery and not filtering, and it's about platforms, not services. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of quick questions if colleagues have any questions or comments on Catriona. The lady here has got her hand up. If we can get a microphone to her, please. Please could you let us know who you are and ask a question.
Deborah Canfield in the States, School of Fine Art. I wanted to ask you about, particularly actually about images. You were talking about the reuse of material, and the only thing I think I worry about some of the open access, getting the feeling that actually the images can be used in different contexts, so your context they're showing is out of control, but also a lot of artists spend years making those images, very often not funded at all, and part of their income actually is from licensing the images. So what happens in terms of that use?
I think that's different, but sorry. For artists or musicians who are making money from their work and don't have a government-funded salary, which research has done on side, I think it's a different model. And they should get commercial rights to those images.
So can you, with an open access paper, could you?
Yeah, you could have restrictions on certain images. I mean, certainly it's something we do at PLOS because we can't reuse images that are copyrighted and things. And although we explain a lot to authors, we sometimes have to remove images and publish corrections, but they haven't understood the license. So you have to be careful. The other thing in terms of humanities related, there are some images and things which might be sensitive in terms of ethnicity, so there need to be protections depending on certain areas, just like sort of patient confidentiality. There have to be exceptions in some cases.
So the protections will remain?
The protections will remain, and there are Creative Commons licenses which might allow people to look at them for free, but not to use them, and that sort of thing.
Any more questions? Yes, gentleman there at the back. This will be our last question, I'm afraid, before the second session.
Lambert Petridis from the East Dental Institute. Thank you for the presentation. I think this is the way forward. But the truth of the matter is that in academia, we'll still be interested in many areas of going to good high impact factor journals. So if I want to publish tomorrow, the first thing I'm being taught is you have to find a good high impact factor journal. Usually it's changing into that, but it's very slow. So can you comment on that? How am I supposed to publish tomorrow if I have a choice between an open access and a impact factor journal? And also, that in some databases that are run by publishers, you cannot really access open access journals. You go to the database, you put the keywords, but only the other journals, the paid journals are coming up.
Yeah, well, to speak to your second point first, I think you have to be very careful about some open access offerings by some journals that are actually very restrictive. And you need to check the licenses and do that. And I think probably Yvonne might speak about the data and data sharing in respect. I'm not sure, but the first point about the impact factor, getting rid of that culture is huge. I mean, when we launched PLOS Biology, we thought we'd be able to launch the equivalent of Nature and Science, and all research would become flopping. Even though we had Nobel laureates founding the publisher and great scientists on board, and that, but they didn't. And even yesterday, when I was in Lausanne, the Dean of Science there said that the universities in Switzerland are ranked on the number of science and nature papers that they publish. And I think that the culture has to be changed from the top in terms of how work is assessed. I think Hefty's initiative is quite radical, actually, in that. And of course, some of these high-impact journals are allowing some reuse, and you can put in repositories and things, but you have to be careful about embargoes. There are certain deals with GN papers that are free to use in Nature, and that. So there is a push. But ultimately, I think we've got to show that there are other metrics available out there whereby you can measure the merit of an article. And not just the article, but actually there's many people that are produce fantastic data sets and they don't get rewarded either in the same way. So I think there is a problem with the culture, and that takes time to change.
You point out that the easiest to ask you to publish in a high impact journal, the number of citations your paper gets is uncorrelated with the impact.
Well,
the journal in which it appears has been known since the 90s.
That's right.
But not apparently by some senior academics.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, it's amazing. But there's actually in that paper about research assessment, there's a graph there that shows the distribution of citations within high impact journal, about 30 or so, and journals with an impact factor of 4 or 5, and the distribution within journals is much bigger than that between journals.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on. There will be time, as I say, at the round table at the end for general questions and comments with the panel.